Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. It is July 1926, and July heats up enough to require 2 episodes. We will start part 1 with a bomb blast that is mistaken for a bank robbery in progress, and witness the introduction of the use of the wireless radio to broadcast major crimes in progress. In our only follow-up, we introduce mostly new news, but it has a connection to old friend, bank robber and murderer Gerald Chapman, and is a horrifying tale. And with that tale, we add yet another soul to our memorial honor roll list. Our 3 quick hitters take us from Kansas to Wyoming and on to California for 2 successful bank robberies and one that is nipped in the bud. And our main story involves another prison farm escape that utilizes utter violence and forces us to add another victim to the memorial honor roll. General crime and anti-bank robbery. The Imperial Valley Press brings us a story titled "Aerial Bomb is Mistaken for Bank Robbery." Taking place in San Diego, California, it turns out it was a misunderstanding by the Junior Chamber of Commerce Stunt Committee. Who'd have thought there was such a thing? And R.L. Williams was arrested for unleashing 2 aerial bombs at Union and Broadway in San Diego. It was an accident. However, hearing the blast, area police assumed that it was either an all-out jailbreak or a bank robbery in progress. Motorcycle patrolmen Merritt and McNelly got close enough to where the bombs were discharged that they could actually smell gunpowder, and they ended up finding a trench mortar, which I'm wondering if it wasn't recent World War I vintage. And in a nearby vehicle there were even more bombs waiting to be blown off. Well, Chamber President Thompson intervened on R.L. Williams' behalf, thereby being able to explain things and prevent Williams from a night in jail. Police in their, the horses out of the barn approach lectured Williams on the ills of lighting off fireworks. And though it's kind of a silly or amusing story, it does suggest how people were becoming so used to the idea of bank robberies taking place, of wanton criminality, and how violence was readily employed. The New Britain Daily Herald chronicled a meeting that took place, and the topic of the meeting was to discuss the use of broadcasting through local radio stations when major crimes had happened. So kidnapping and bank robberies were tops on the list. It was believed that by using wireless, as they called it, that they could connect throughout the state, in this case the state of Connecticut, they could connect police departments together to improve their odds, I guess, of catching criminals. Electrically operated writing machines were going to be installed in some of the more significant or larger towns and cities throughout the state in various police stations, and they'd be connected by telephone wire so that the information could be spread more rapidly, which honestly it almost sounds like a predecessor of a fax machine. WTIC, which was a venerable radio station even at the time, was willing to participate in the experiment. Our only follow-up takes place in Atlanta, Georgia, but it is the Bismarck Tribune that brings us the story, the July 29, 1926 tale of the assassination of Burt Donaldson. Donaldson was a special investigator for the county solicitor in Atlanta, and he'd been successful, this Donaldson had been, with ridding Atlanta of a $1 million bunco ring, B-U-N-C-O. This took place a few years earlier. A bunco ring, we don't use the term anymore, it comes from banco, B-A-C-N-O, so Spanish for bank, and it's basically a swindle. Typically you'd see people swindle wealthy elderly out of their funds. Today we would think of it as like the Nigerian prince kind of emails that we get. 9,999 people out of 10,000 would say no. One might say, oh my gosh, yes. That person gets swindled. They are a victim of a bunco ring. We just don't use the term anymore. But Donaldson was successful in ridding Atlanta of a major bunco ring. He'd also been very successful and extremely persistent in tracking down murderer Jack Wilson. He'd been wanted for murder for a while, and police believe that that persistence of chasing Wilson probably led to his slaying in what was called a fashionable hotel. I believe it was the Terrace Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia. So here's how it happened. Investigator Donaldson left his home Thursday evening after a phone call. This is according to his wife. She became alarmed when he'd not come home the following morning. So she called detectives to let them know what was going on. The detectives went to the Terrace Hotel and they found Donaldson in a room with shotgun blasts to his head and back. They determined that by the position of the body and the presence of a chair that had been set up in the closet, that the slayer, the killer, had just waited in the closet until Donaldson got there and then ambushed him without warning. And it turned out that Donaldson was unarmed at the time. But here's an odd twist. Burt Donaldson, the special investigator, had a record. An investigation of his record showed that he'd once served a 1-year term in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. And that was in connection with the robbery of a post office. And that he'd also been arrested following the $300,000 mail robbery at Rochester, New York, for which Dutch Anderson, who was an associate of infamous murderer and bank robber Gerald Chapman, was originally sentenced to Atlanta. Donaldson was released, and if you're interested in pursuing more about his story, there are tons of sites online. I've included just 3 in the description below. Now, the interesting and touching news, I think, is that Donaldson had actually renounced his criminal life, was ordained in the ministry, and had begun to work on prison reform. Anyway, back to the crime. Solicitor General John A. Boykin determined that the gunman had been imported from Chicago by a local criminal element. It's not a surprise that they would bring in hitters from Chicago. Now, according to the New York Times, quote, a scar-faced man, end quote, was the focus of a nationwide search assumed to have been the assassin. The Officer Down memorial page, which I've mentioned in the past and is linked again in this case, provides lots of more detail and kind of fleshes things out for us a little bit. Donaldson was 54. Apparently, he'd been lured to this hotel by one gangster and actually led to the room where he was later murdered. He was ambushed by the alleged assassin in the closet, who, based on what we know already, burst out without warning, shot Donaldson twice from behind in the head and the back, and they ended up, the 2 gangsters locked the door and fled. But it makes me wonder, how did other guests not notice or react in some way to a shotgun going off once with 2 shots fired at the same time, or with repeated shots? Anyway, according to the Officer Down memorial page, it was cleaning staff that found the body the next day, not detectives, as was noted in the Bismarck Tribune. Now, here's a spoiler alert. Remember, we're in July of 1926, but let's pretend we can go forward to 1927 just for fun. We find out that a former police officer has confessed to the killing and that he participated along with 9 others. So we're talking about 10 men who were involved in the assassination of Burt Donaldson. However, ultimately, only one suspect was convicted, and he was sentenced to death. But even he had a retrial about a year later, and he was acquitted. All charges versus all the others, all 10 of them, were dismissed. Now, on the face of it, this sounds suspicious. Burt Donaldson was survived by his wife, and he is buried in Casey's Hill Cemetery in Atlanta. The Find a Grave site, which is linked, does a good job on filling out pictures and other information regarding this facet of the Burt Donaldson story. Quick hitters. Number 1. The Brownsville Herald noted that 2 men dressed as, quote, harvest hands, or like a farmer, like you picture a farmer, entered the Guada, G-E-U-D-A, Guada Springs National Bank in Kansas, forced cashier J.H. Ratliff to scoop up all the money that was in the safe and on the counters and everywhere he could find cash, scrape it together. Meanwhile, his partner, so Ratliff was guided by one of the robbers, and the other robber covered the other 5 people who were there. By covered, I mean he held them at gunpoint to not move. The robbers ended up getting the 5 out of the back room, the 5 customers, with Ratliff, and they locked them all 6 of them, in the safe and took off. So obviously more to come on this story. Quick hitter 2, the Buffalo Bulletin, the paper out of Wyoming, covered a bank heist that was quashed before it even was able to take place. Edward Rush and William Rogers tried to entice their taxi driver to essentially be their getaway driver for their upcoming bank heist. It appears that the taxi driver said, "Yes, I'll help," and then he must have spoken to the police at some point, because the heist never took place. In fact, there was a raid on the robbers' hotel rooms, and that raid revealed firearms and ammunition. In I think a telling twist, when Rush was arrested, he had a newspaper clipping on him from a newspaper from Beaverton, Oregon. It was dated January 5th, 1925, and Rush was pictured as a conspirator in a similar bank heist plot where the would-be robbers were arrested shortly before the robbery could take place. So it appears that Rush is now 0 for 2 on robberies and should probably retroactively consider not robbing another bank. It'll be interesting to see if he actually attempts to rob a bank and does so successfully. So for sure we'll follow up on Edward Rush and William Rogers. Number 3, the Cody Enterprise covered a California robbery because one of the main characters was an early resident of Cody, Wyoming. John Myers, that resident, featured in what the paper called one of the, quote, greatest and boldest, end quote, bank robberies, when a group of bandits stuck up the Marine Trust and Savings Bank at Long Beach, California, and were able to escape with $10,000. Myers was the night watchman, and not surprisingly, being from Cody, Wyoming, had a reputation as being excellent with a firearm. But it turns out that the robber got the drop on him. Myers and all the other employees were kept undercover, under guard, by some of the other robbers, while other robbers, quote, made away with the swag, end quote. And I've linked a Long Beach, California map, ironically made by Marine Trust, in the description below. So we'll follow up on all the quick hitters, but now we get to our main story. Now, we covered the Tucker prison farm in a previous episode and chronicled the deadly, failed, would-be prison escape attempt. Now we have the Brownsville Herald, which takes us to Texas for a successful, similar prison farm escape. And this is also a deadly event. So here's what went down. We have 3 liberators who apparently cut the telephone wires that connected Ferguson Prison Farm to the phone line. Then they drove 2 cars right onto the farm, right up to the barracks buildings at about 12:15 a.m. They immediately opened fire on a man named Rader and killed him instantly. Rader was noted as a trusted man and had been a guard for 10 years. He was 50 years old and left behind a family of 5. So I'm not sure if trusted man equated to trustee, as in he was a prisoner, and I don't know if Raider, R-A-I-D-E-R, is his surname, his given name, or a nickname, regardless of his status as a trustee, meaning he'd been a prisoner, or a guard, a civilian. He'll also be, regrettably, added to our memorial honor roll list. It turned out that Raider was finishing off his night duty. That was kind of the last of his rounds he was on. After slaying Raider, the criminals pounced on his dead body and grabbed the keys off of him and entered the barracks with pistols allegedly pulled out, and they called out 6 specific names: George Dixon, Charles Pryor, Richard Naylor, C.R. Holland, Robert Bernard, and Alvin Ireland. So we know the 6 names, so who are these guys and why are they there? Dixon had been sentenced to 30 years for safe robbery, so he was a YEG. He escaped in April of 1921 and was recaptured. Pryor was there sentenced also to 30 years. He was sentenced for murder. He escaped May 5th, 1923 and was recaptured. Naylor was sentenced to only 2 years for burglary and felony theft. He'd escaped November 12th, 1925 and was recaptured. So at this point, 3 of these prisoners have already escaped at least once. So again, I'll go retroactively and suggest that they beef up their security. Anyway, Holland. He'd actually been sent to Ferguson Prison Farm from Bexar and Guadalupe counties to serve 25 years for robbery with firearms and assault to murder. Of course, he also had an escape on his record from November 1st, 1925, and he also was recaptured a few days later. There was no information on Bernard, which is kind of strange. And then Alvin Ireland. Ireland is our bank robbery connection. He'd been sentenced to 20 years for bank robbery in Archer County, which I believe is Archer County, Texas. He escaped right before Christmas in 1925, and they don't list his recapture date, but clearly he'd been recaptured. So 6 men who were specifically selected to be broken out of Ferguson Prison Farm. And I suspect that they were anticipating this coming, but the other convicts who were there were dazed by the activity. Again, it was 12:30 in the morning. They'd presumably been asleep, so they were kind of dazed by what was going on. The 3 liberators and 6 escapees, or 2 liberators and 9 escapees if we consider the New York Times article, fled, with police being on the lookout for the 2 vehicles. So there is tons to follow up on to find out where these guys, how far they got. So with part 1 of July, we saw some bank heists. We saw deadly revenge by people with connections to bank robberies. And we've already added 2 souls to the Memorial Honor Roll list, and this is all only in part 1. We'll follow up on all of these characters and these stories from this episode as information comes to light. But for now, we'll move ahead to part 2 of July 1926. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Until next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye bye, blackbird.